that the host is blocking.
Yeah, please check now.
Okay.
So, hello everyone. This is our Big Data Conference. This is our business track with Rohan D'Souza. He is EVP with Olive, and he will present his talk on, oops, lost my window, where to start with AI in the online system and in your health system. So there's a Q&A section where you can post all the questions for Rohan. And if you prefer to come live, there is a Q&A section at the end of the talk. You can raise your hand, I will unmute you, and you can ask your question to Rohan. There's a chat option also available where you can post any other comments or resources. So Rohan, you can start now.
Okay, just want to confirm you guys can see my screen, and it should have a slide that says where to start with AI in your health system. Okay, I don't see anybody. Okay, awesome.
Yes,
Thank
I can
you.
see.
Great. Well, thanks so much for having me. I hope everyone's been having a great session so far, and I'm looking forward to this talk, and I'm looking forward to some questions. So feel free to have them come in the chat, like it was already mentioned. So a little bit about me. As already mentioned, my name is Rohan D'Souza. I'm an EVP and General Manager at Olive. A little bit about the company. We're headquartered in Columbus, Ohio, but just like most other places, we have really embraced a remote work culture, and we are now Olivians all over the US. I myself am based here in Seattle, Washington, but the bulk of our team is in Columbus and growing across the country. My background is I'm formally trained in epidemiology and statistics, but I took a little different track, and I have focused primarily in enterprise healthcare software delivery. I started my career back at a large electronic medical records vendor, and I focused on revenue cycle applications and centralized decision support for population health programs, and had the opportunity to work with some really incredible health systems across the US and what eventually went outside of the US on some great applications and real applications of decision support and analytics. Prior to Olive, I was at a machine learning startup here in Seattle, building out a end-to-end machine learning platform for health systems to implement within their enterprise. And I am a big vocal proponent of system interoperability and everything with giving patients access to their data. And I have been part of the early workings of the HL7 Foundation and consortium around both designing the Smart on Fire framework that originally came out of the Jason Foundation from the government, and then also implementation in almost every place that I've gone. So today, like the topic says, we're talking about AI investments in health systems. I pulled up this Accenture report, that talks about just the incredible amount of growth in the AI healthcare market space, where it's expected to reach about 6.6 billion by 2021. That's obviously amounts to a compounded annual growth rate of about 40%. And Accenture predicts that when combined with key sort of clinical health AI applications, it could potentially create $150 billion in just savings alone for the US healthcare economy by 2026. Olive as a company's mission is actually to take $1 trillion out of healthcare. It's sort of a very different world than what was just presented on some incredibly novel techniques. towards better disease detection and prediction. We're more in the traditional operational and financial space. But the application is just incredible, and technology is really allowing us to enable for that process. But one of the consequences of all of this, just incredible press and jazz around the concept of AI is it's created a little bit of this joke everywhere, right? You cannot walk the hallways of a health system today in any sort of strategic conversation or budget level discussions where health systems are hearing this word AI thrown at them from hundreds of different places. From novel AI to disease prediction to something that might really look like just a process improvement that is being branded as an artificial intelligence program. So I think most hospital administrators, buyers, decision makers are really having a hard time identifying what is actually the meaning of AI. And so I'd like to, just talk about a very applied use case and an applied world of the way we see the world of artificial intelligence. For simplicity, I've just, put this in a little bit of a hierarchy to think about AI as this broad term, and we will talk about various different components of it. Machine learning comes to mind in a lot of different places, and for the scientists and the data scientists in the room or in the audience, that in itself fans out into so many different places. Supervised, unsupervised learning, predictive modeling, computer vision is the other one that is talked about heavily. And then of course, conversational AI. So this concept of the human out of the loop through a conversational bot or a human in the loop process. I'm going to keep this conversation very simple to help health systems identify those easy opportunities for the implementation of artificial intelligence within their environment. So the one that I'd like to talk about is this concept of automation. And one of the areas that is of interest to a lot of folks is in the world of revenue cycle management. Revenue cycle, especially if you are coming in from a world of healthcare that is driven heavily based on an insurance paradigm, which is here in the United States and maybe a little parts of other places of the world, there is an incredible amount of back office support that is needed to ensure that health systems are actually paid for the services that they render. And the process of capturing that payment is extremely involved. The process of making sure that patients are registered in the right way is heavily involved. And it poses some interesting challenges, right? Health systems have a very high staff turnover. There's incredible amount of complexity in workflows because it goes down to the actual insurance, and every insurance company today has multiple different plan types. Reimbursement rates are obviously reducing because of various different complexities that are baked into these complex workflows, but more importantly, as models of care change. And last but not least is the age-old challenge with health systems is an incredible amount of disparity in IT systems and just work drivers. And so if you think about layering AI value on top of these, from a staff perspective, you can think about reducing or augmenting staffing, right? It's a simple thing that is talked about, especially during budget conversations, far easier said than done. Automating of time-consuming and manual tasks, the ability to think about how do we prevent a downstream catastrophic event of a claim being denied, and then last but not least is figure out a way that we can facilitate some amount of standardization of process across the system. Now, what this has created is the gap between perceived value and recognized value, or likely what we talk as the promise that this can bring versus the actual reality, right? So with AI being this incredible pivotal lever that can be pulled to drive efficiency and outcomes, the promise is 94% of them believe that AI can provide this competitive advantage, but almost 50% of these standard projects that can be classified under the robotic process automation world tend to fail, or they deliver far less expected ROI. So how can we now convince health systems that it's actually worth taking this risk, because the outcome, even though the outcomes are TBD? So one way of thinking about this is you might be in a position to figure out how to think of partners, right? A lot of systems are, hey, can we do this in-house? But most healthcare organizations today are really focused on thinking of them as being in the business of delivering really good care and not having to worry about all the complexities to manage the operations on the back end to ensure that that care is reimbursed. So here's an interesting quote, and I say this even as somebody representing a company and multiple companies in the past, is there's a lot of people who claim that they have figured this out and they have a solution to the problem. But a lot of folks are in that journey to find out what that actual solution is. And I'm, full disclaimer, I'm not saying that we at Olive have even figured that out. So if we think about the massive value that is that can be unlocked through this AI process, one of the things that a lot of folks tend to forget is most health systems today are sitting on an incredible data asset in the form of a decade's worth of investment that was made in digitalizing their systems. And the original sort of high-tech funding that came that allowed for large health systems to invest in EMR and practice management technology, one would argue that you're not really seeing a ton of those benefits that were promised way back in the investment cycle. So it's important to start to think about how do we introduce a process where we can, one, first of all, identify which parts of our business could benefit from an AI-driven approach. We have to think about a scoping process, because there's a famous Harvard Business Review article about you walk a very fine line between capitalizing and capsizing. So you have to think about a prioritization framework, which involves you along with your partner that you choose in order to map back to the resources, the workflows, the system dependencies, to then eventually create that robust project plan / AI implementation strategy before you start to recognize any of that value. So what I'm trying to say here is it's a pretty involved process, and don't take it lightly. If you're going to go into it, really approach it as a problem that you want to tackle head on. And then some other considerations to ensure your program is unlocking that massive value that might have come off as like a perceived value step back in your planning phase is to think about various different variables in your overall equation. Number one is think about your platform and partner selection, right? Do you have the capability to build, buy, or partner? Is this a hybrid strategy? Do you have the right resources to build any type of automation capability? What is the supporting matrix and the supportability that's required? Does your partner have the right strategy to put in place? Are you considering your value as cost plus return? And so then you go onto your scoping phase and your implementation phase. So it's a pretty involved process, and I'm sure you owe yourself and your peers a due diligence beyond just the technical capabilities of what a solution can provide. One of the things that makes this whole value equation a little bit hard to calculate is the hidden aspects of the support structure when you're thinking about a total cost of ownership, or a TCO, right? So Forrester basically said for every dollar that is spent on RPA software under the AI lens, about $3.50 were spent on services to actually make it work. And the hidden cost there, or the hidden cost in the form of additional services and process, makes up about 77%. This is your strategy development, establishing your governance committees, thinking about your steering committees, what are the KPIs that you're going to attach your work to, because healthcare buys outcomes, right? Healthcare does not necessarily just buy technology for a cool factor to try it out. So it's important to think about these things when you are starting off on your AI journey, and don't just fall into the trap of thinking that this is only a technology investment. I talked a little bit about key performance indicators. Revenue cycle is flooded with KPIs. I've given some examples of that over here. You should know where you're at with your existing key performance indicators, whether it's something as, rudimentary or very high level strategic as days in AR or percent to bad debt. You should know where you stand with that and where those KPIs have been trending before you decide to start an implementation. I've given some examples of what those typically are with customers that we engage with. These could be the accuracy rate attached with registration, right? What percent of patients that we register at the front door, we're actually collecting the most accurate information about that consumer, because it has massive downstream implications, right? Best practice according to places like HFMA and others tell you to start it, you should be at about a 95% of registration accuracy. Thinking about emergency department and outpatient coding backlog days, right? You need to be under a day for that. Your first pass claims acceptance should be at 95%, or vice versa. Your initial denial rate should be less than 5%. So these are important things to think about when you're starting your journey as you implement strategies for AI within your health system. The other challenge that systems have is because there are so many incredible opportunities to introduce automation capabilities under the umbrella of AI. There are various places and entry points that serve as good candidates for automation. We call them candidates for process automation. We have a team that comes out and takes a look at it, but we look at the standard things like, are there costly errors? Is there a process that's digital, such as like scanning cards, OCRing, things like that? Meaningful impact to value and KPIs. Are there tasks that are repetitive and pretty low variability, or ones that are highly resource intensive, right? I have to go in and download a file from the insurance company every single day, and all I have to do is press a button to generate the file in Excel. Well, there has to be a way that we can just automate that process and give time back to the healthcare worker to do the things that they're really, really good at doing, which is delivering care. So what we look at is value levers under the automation side. And we can look at them as things that impact the bottom line that are in the middle, which is your cost drivers. So what are the things that exist between the top and the bottom line that could help drive impact? And so under the cost structure, it's wage costs, overtime and temp staffing, outsourcing, software vendor costs, regulatory compliance. These are things that most chief financial officers and operations officers are constantly looking at. The others are, what can we do to influence top line growth? So net patient revenue, any form of revenue that the system is generating. These are your standard like gross charge capture improvements. How do we figure out improvements in write-offs? Better use of provider scheduling and productivity, right? So how do we make sure, like, do we really need a 30-minute appointment for a provider when it could be done in 15 minutes through a televisit, or vice versa? This is really a 30-minute appointment and we've only booked 15 minutes, and provider productivity and utilization is really going to be hampered because there's a swirl on patient satisfaction. And the other areas are cash acceleration, patient sat, patient leakage, et cetera, et cetera. One of the tips we tell is most organizations find at least a 3-to-1 ratio between value from a net revenue lever versus a cost reduction lever. So I took one example of a classic case where you could implement an AI strategy focused around robotic process automation to improve a pretty mundane and a routine task that happens, which is around prior auth. So here's an example workflow. A bot checks when an upcoming appointment is scheduled. It compiles the list of appointments that require that prior authorization. And it sends a very asynchronous message to the manager and says, I am going to, a staff member is initiating that prior authorization through that message. And every single day, this bot checks for the authorization status. And in some cases, you might be in a situation where you don't have a clearinghouse and you don't have APIs to talk to every single payer portal. An AI bot can do that for you, right? It can log into the portal, it can check, it could function almost like a human worker, and then present back what it ended up finding out so that you can avoid that downstream denial from becoming something, right? And so one of the challenges with this is, how do we think about change management and the alignment of resources, right? We're talking training people, we're talking about changing workflows that might exist. And Ernst & Young had this great post that talks about, 50% of the failure in these automation projects doesn't really have to do with the technology. We have made incredible advancements in cloud, computer vision, scraping, OCR, like everything, right? And the cost of this computing is only going down. The challenge becomes on the change management side, right? There are a number of successful deployments, but the most common mistakes is organizations forget that there are things that you could do from a change management perspective to prevent a lot of these things from landing up into this bucket of, oh, 1 out of 2 of these things don't end up working. And so one of the things we tell our customers is, beyond the topic of thinking about a technology investment, what are the pillars that you need to establish for a successful change management? Think about your communication strategy, right? You have to be a change driver in your organization to really be that voice of reason and that ambassador to explain the imperative for change. Think about what expectations are across your organization. What is your governance structure, right? Who are your sponsors into the program? What are they going to be measuring people on? And who's going to decide whether something that is done in a quote unquote lab setting or in an offline setting should actually move to the real world or production setting? What is the cost of the false positive? Right sizing for your future staffing for each of these functions. And then eventually reskilling your resources, right? Going to job fairs, consolidation of job functions. And then, denials tend to be the natural place that most people think of starting. It's where upskilling workers with extra capacity, but 48% of denied claims are typically appealed, and 90% of these denied claims are recoverable. There's a lot of that you could create in some sort of an automation with a strong governance model to support it. Questions you should ask yourself when you're thinking about a strategy to put around change management is, how can our communication strategy be aligned with the organizational culture, right? Every healthcare is very community driven. You're likely most health systems are functioning in a non-for-profit world. But at the end of the day, they're in a services industry that wants to deliver the top service and quality of care. What is your communication strategy? How does it align to that? What fears and questions should we expect? How can I handle this concern that, oh my God, my job might be replaced by a bot, right? This is a lot about augmented intelligence and not fully artificial intelligence. How can we create opportunities to upskill our staff, right? Training, webinars, thinking about getting better at understanding what a bot or a model does. And then how do we create a culture where staff is incentivized to share these automation ideas, right? Today, you might be working with 25 people in a call center that are saying, gosh, I wish that this could just be automated for me, or a certain percent of it could be automated so that I can do this other task. Versus if I present a plan for automation, there's a risk that my job will no longer exist, right? So you have to find that right balance within that organization. And then work with somebody who really thinks about phases within your project, right? There is no silver bullet that exists today. I wish I could tell you that. Most AI problems today or most AI solutions to problems are heavily involved on both sides. Think of it as an investment for your future versus an immediate return of your investment. It's a paradigm shift in how jobs are done, but that it requires involvement. It requires information gathering. It requires an actual formal program kickoff. And it requires true enterprise adoption where it just becomes ubiquitous across the organization. And this is just an example of a governance structure of how involved this process is, right? So I'm being very honest with large health systems that there is no one vendor today that can come in and say, look, I have the right solution for you and I can implement this strategy and within 30 days you have a significant return. Most vendors who have been through this have been through the pain of telling people that story and have realized now to be pretty transparent and saying that this is a pretty involved process that involves a steering committee, a build team, functional advisory councils, and this has to be a cultural thing within the organization to start to accept. I'm looking at time and I want to give some time for questions. So if it's okay, I'll probably skip through this slide and move and give enough time for Q&A, but I hope that was helpful to the audience listening in, and I can take any questions that might come up.
So thank you, Rohan. That was very informative talk. It was like drinking from the fire hose. So again, attendees, there is an option to ask the live question. You just have to raise your hand and I'll unmute you so you can interact with the speaker here. Or there is a Q&A section where you can post your question and then Rohan will take it from there.
There are no questions. You have still time, Rohan. If you want, you can continue.
Yeah. Someone asked for a copy of the presentation. Are you guys? This session is recorded, right? So, and are we going to PDF? Yeah. I'm happy to share it. That's not a problem.
Yeah, please send your PDF. We'll make it available to the audience later next week.
Perfect. Yep.
Yeah, no questions. You can go ahead with some best practices or anything if you want to share. We have still 5 more minutes.
Yeah, no, I'll stick around and see if there are any other questions that come up. But like I was saying, I think, you know, a lot of this is about technology, but really think about the implementation strategy and the buy-in from your stakeholders. Don't be afraid to try things, especially if you can ring fence a small little project team and go through its evolution process. None of these things are going to come out of the gate unless it's an FDA approved clinical decision support tool that has been through, you know, an RTC and multiple different publications before it comes out of the box and say, look, we have the best model to do this. Today, most of us on the technology side are really looking to challenge the status quo, and challenging the status quo is hard. So just be ready for that when you're engaging with your vendors.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Yeah, you have experience in epidemiology. Okay, now to what extent? I've also done some disease modeling. To what extent are you able to use your knowledge of epidemiology in, for example, looking at the data and the possible solutions in COVID, for example?
So, in full transparency, at my current place, we haven't dabbled in that too much. But in a prior life, there are companies. For example, my previous employer, KenSci, we were doing this a lot. So we were working on a large public health project, actually, with the city of Chicago, where we were trying to look at surge patterns, and we were trying to look at um, biases and sort of the imbalance in communities and disparities that might exist in a densely populated area like Chicago. I think even till now, Cook County is one of the largest, or the county that has one of the largest COVID confirmed databases. Um, the I think the aspects of epidemiology and just pushing the needle on research and statistics is still a little bit siloed from getting in front of a production world to actually inform decision making at either the point of care or to prevent something from happening. Historically, I think those two worlds have existed outside of each other, and they really do need to come together. The data's there. The infrastructure to support a lot of this modeling exists. I think the challenge is just fighting for budgets. Most of epidemiology research was coming in the form of research grants versus less of like a CIO line item in a health system that actually is incentivized to move this epidemiology research into a production world.
I have a question relating to policy, which bears in this. For example, in both in the US and in India, some mistakes have been made in not realizing that something like COVID is a distributed problem, okay? And you can't have one solution fits all, okay? So these are, for example, you say centralized solution, top down, lock down everything or release everything. And in many minds, that's a wrong way of doing things. There are parts of the country where the population density is small and you really don't want a complete lockdown. And in other parts, when there are special problems, you do need that. So the data have to, this aspect of the data has to affect the selection of the policy. Now, what comment would you have to make in say, I mean, it's a large question and things have to be made under time pressures to get huge amount of data. To what extent do you see that AI methods can bear on it?
Yeah, it's there's a lot to unpack in that question, and I also think that it's an opinion question too. So I think a policy sometimes is, we all need policy, we all need rules, and we all need governance models. One thing that COVID has done, just because you brought it up, so I'll touch on COVID in a sense. COVID has completely, it's accelerated the digital innovation. Actually, I shouldn't even say innovation. I should say the digital adoption in healthcare. Like 15 years of healthcare digital adoption has happened in 150 days. So a lot of these companies, it's not like they were sprung up because of COVID. They were allowed to bring their products to the front and center of solving these problems because of reimbursement laws that were changed, right? I spoke about this on my panel. Telemedicine is a classic example of this. So connecting back to your question about lockdown, and I think the higher order question is, who owns the data? At the end of the day, you and I as consumers and as patients, we own the data, right? It should be in our interest and in our sort of decision making to decide how we want our data to be used. Who do we want our data? Who do we want accessing our data, and how do we feel comfortable about them accessing our data? It really has to come to that. I think the consumer and the patient in the decision making process really needs to become the next part of the discussion.
So
Lena, I know we're at 2:50. Are there any questions you want me to stick around some more?
so Krishnan, I believe Krishnan already asked his question, right?
Yes.
So I think we are done with all the question and answers. Thank you, Rohan. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Great. Well, thank you guys. Have a good weekend and enjoy the rest of the event.
You too, as well.